overview of biomass electricity in Maine that I thought would help set some context for what we discussed last time about judging how you think about carbon carbon impacts of different uses of wood and especially of the energy. I had hoped that I could put together some things that would enable us to translate the stuff that Jake has put together, where he's showing how much difference it makes to carbon if we use more saw logs or more paper or more pulp or more biomass. And I got lost in a swamp of stuff, so I wasn't able to get anything that is very helpful. I think maybe if we bring back your friend Grant Domke, he may be able to have some stuff that will help us apply this better. But as I thought about this business of the biomass electricity, I thought that you might be interested in a bit of a short story, because some of you weren't around for the whole development of that industry and the subsequent disappearance of it or near disappearance. So I'm going to give that little quick briefing. Then Jake and possibly backstopped by Ken and myself if he wants to, we'll review some pretty nice charts that he's put together, and we'll discuss what you can see from a period of, depending on which chart he's got some very long history. He's also got some more recent history, so we can see what's really happening with the different major uses of the wood that's being cut in the main forest. We should have almost a good hour or so for doing that. And then I think, John, you wanted to say a few things about a Bloomberg article that talked about carbon projects.
No, I'm not going to talk about that today.
Oh, okay.
I would like to ask the group at the end just 5 minutes about what they'd like to talk about next time. I've got some thoughts about that and just want to hear what people might be interested in. So we'll close out with that at the end.
So that'll be about what we're going to do. And I think Jake can decide whether you want to take questions and do discussion as we go or otherwise, but we can play that by ear. So we ready, John, for?
We're good to go. We're recording too. So
okay. I have a PowerPoint. I'm not going to put it up for you because you can have plenty of PowerPoint today, but it's going to be more of a narrative. And John is going to have this PowerPoint up in case you want to look at this more specifically, take issue with some of the things I've said. This is a very, what I'm calling a selective and interpretive history. And it's not a typical Lloyd Earl presentation with all kinds of charts and graphs and data. It's going to be more interpretive. I do have two other documents that I think John has, which provide a lot of data, historical charts on different types of biomass that have been used for electrical power. And the scope is, for now, is these centralized electric generating stations. And of course, there's much more going on in biomass with space heating, standalone electric power, steam or CHP at either paper mills or sawmills, mulch market for bark. Then there's, of course, retaining the material on the land for the organic matter and nutrients, and also on, I think, best practice logging jobs to basically provide a kind of a protective mulch in your skidder trails instead of hauling it someplace and chipping it up and burning it. And there are probably others I haven't thought about. And for a forestry audience, I don't need to go into a lot of detail on it, but biomass turns out to be a pretty broad category. We think of trees, but biomass as viewed from the point of view of a operator of a biomass generating plant actually covers a lot more things. And I should say, full disclosure, I have done work for many of the owners and operators of these biomass plants in the past, which is partly how I have a more nitty-gritty understanding of what they do than I otherwise would. So I have worked for them in the past, and that's just a fair disclosure. So we go everything from the tops and branches that are left after a conventional logging job to bullwood to what you call urban waste wood, which would be all the trees that come down from storms in cities. There's a biomass plant, which I think is a district heating steam plant actually in Minneapolis, is it, that runs heavily on urban waste wood from the metro area. Wood that would have to be hauled somewhere else to just get it out of the way or landfilled someplace. And that's a category of a feedstock that has what you call negative feedstock cost, at least negative in-place feedstock cost. In other words, by making use of it this way, we're getting something that would cost someone money to get rid of it. Then you have primary mill byproducts like bark from a sawmill. You have secondary mill byproducts, which are often from urban areas too. New York City has more employment, that last time I looked anyway, in furniture and related wood processing industries than this whole state of Maine. And it makes sense. It's a metro area of 10 million people, a lot of furniture cabinets, a lot of woodwork is done there. But what are you going to do with all those piles of product? That's often, again, a negative feedstock cost situation. And then there's other stuff that we call true waste, such as bark piles that were piled when nobody had any market for buy, and it's now an actual environmental disamenity. DEP is going to say, get rid of these bark piles, they're polluting the water, or things like yard waste and other stuff, or stumps that really nobody could do anything else with. So those are all the possible sources of biomass when you look at it from the standpoint of a company that's going to buy fiber to run through a grinder and make it into electricity. Obviously, some of these sources are not relevant for space heating for many other uses that we would have of biomass. And all of these they rate differently. If you ask how renewable are they, all of them have different kind of aspects of judging their renewability. Some of them cost more. An example would be biomass from thinning probably costs more than just biomass from whole tree chipping entire stands. Some of them will cost less and they're cheap. And some, as they say, have negative feedstock cost, at least negative feedstock cost in place. I'd love to give you some great anecdotes and examples of these, but I don't want to take too much time away from other things. And some of these uses displace fossil fuels, others perhaps do not. And this is pretty important in judging what the net GHG impact of something is what's the counterfactual? What would have happened if we didn't do this? Would we have burned number 6 fuel oil? Would we have burned coal? Would we use nuclear power? Would we use solar power? What is your benchmark for comparing the CO2 impact of any one of these things? So this is something that we'll just have to go by quickly. And I think most of us in this room already understand most of it. Next point that I'd like to make is what I call perspectives. And there's some kind of ironies in this. I have 3 kinds of perspectives. One of them is the enthusiasts, the enthusiastic advocates of an industry that's about to boom and change the world. The idea of Maine as the Saudi Arabia of the North. And then there are people like me who I call the worriers, consultants, politicians, journalists, officials, oftentimes environmental groups. Holy smoke, if all this stuff happens, it's gonna be terrible. And I worry about it because I have people who would hire me to say, is there gonna be enough wood, enough fiber for this plant for the next X years? What's gonna happen? What are the prices gonna do? So they hire people like me to worry about this sort of stuff. And then there are adversaries. Well, if it's changed, Maine's got along for 200 years without this. If it's changed, we're against it. We got to stop this. Or if there might be something bad that happens, we got to stop it. What's ironic is the enthusiasts issue these optimistic predictions. The adversaries and the worriers say, oh no, this would be awful. And they try to stop it. And nobody ever actually talks about what's actually happening. So there's a dynamic there when you have the dynamic between the enthusiastic and the worriers and the adversaries. And I've watched this happen work out in other parts of the world with related issues where by the time the academics are done publishing their worries, the problem has gone away, but we're still convinced that it's going to be terrible because we're working against an over-optimistic forecast to begin with. And you saw some of this in the early days of this biomass industry. And I tried to work out something that would be a diagram that would diagram this. I couldn't make one that was clear enough and simple enough for this purpose. And I tried to make like a chronology, and it just got too messy. So what I ended up doing was saying, well, there are changing definitions of biomass for electricity over time. And I played with that idea a little bit. And this is going to be not quite chronological, but at the beginning, you had this so-called, what I call a flatlander fantasy, that this was waste. All these trees that weren't being used, these were waste. And it's going to be free. So why not go get free fuel? And of course, that accorded with this classic Maine virtual threat. You know, foresters who go out in the woods and they see trees on the ground or cull trees standing up there, they see blowing and say, waste is bad. So the Flatlander fantasy brought a lot of people up there thinking, oh boy, I can get a lot of free fuel or really low cost fuel. The next definition was in the late 70s, early 80s, we had the Seabrook nuclear power plant down there in New Hampshire. How many people remember Seabrook? I remember Seabrook because my wife was working for Central Maine Power, and she was the expert on Seabrook. A canceled plant. Central Maine Power got out of Seabrook, which had a 5-fold cost overrun on the construction of this thing. This is supposed to be the cheapest power in sight, too cheap to meter. Remember those days? Well, it went through the roof. It was a disaster. And then the federal government, it's created a law called the PURPA, the Public Utility Regulation Policy Act. which said basically the bottom line was if a merchant power generator came to you centrally power with power that was cheaper than Seabrook power, then CMP had to buy it. Well, this produced pretty high rates for biomass electricity, pretty high rates. Oh, I can see Ed's really liking this. He's got a big grin on his face right now. So he likes it. But then it was biomass as enabling good management. The landowners loved this because they could get a little more revenue out of the land. We actually had people who did some thinning. They said, we're going to thin with the specialized machinery. Biomass market's going to enable us to take out small stands and thin our stands. And I've been in some of those stands, some of that was done. Or we're going to be able to remove, do a true clear cut of these high-graded hardwood stands and start over, either generate new sprout stand or plant a lot of nice plants, healthy great. And sometimes if you go to some of those places, it was pretty depressing because even dead branches were taken on. There was nothing. There was a lot of bare soil. But so some environmentalists and other people said, oh, that's bad. We don't want more plantations and herbicides and more planted stands. So that use of biomass, that's going in the wrong direction. We don't like that direction. Ironically, in the debate over the Big A Dam on Penobscot, some of you may remember this, Ken, you probably do. One of the bogeys was, oh, you shouldn't build a Big A Dam. You should build a biomass plant. Who was saying that? The environmentalists were saying that. Don't dam the Penobscot, build a biomass plant. Now, here's a funny thing that I realized. At one point, biomass became a verb, right? And we've all used it. They say, oh, we biomass this site before we planted it. So the word became a verb. And as you can tell, it also became in the minds of some people an enemy of the forest. This is bad, overcutting, nutrient losses, bad, bad, bad. Now, here's a funny irony. Charlie Colgan, a colleague of mine, and I wrote an article about economic development based on forests. A long time ago, actually published in the SAF Proceedings Club, I think it was 1978. And we said that of all the economic development programs we could see that were aimed at the forest product sector, the one biggest success was the construction of 10 or a dozen biomass electric power plants through the public utilities regulation system, which was never intended as an economic development program in the first place. But that had more benefit in terms of creating jobs, local tax base, and local markets for local materials than any of the other economic development programs we could think of. Then, as these projects got going, somewhere along the line, EPA decided they were carbon neutral. Now, as soon as EPA says something, someone else is going to say, no, it's wrong. And so we then had a long debate over whether it was really carbon neutral or maybe a little carbon neutral or not. Then what happened was once these things were up and running on these very rich contracts that they got through the PURPA process, it became obvious that these were feeding power into the grid that was too expensive. And we had cheap natural gas. Some of the earlier contracts were so rich that these plants were running for 3 or 4 days a month and still making money. And so then you had buyouts. CFE actually spent gobs of money to buy out those contracts. And by buying the contracts out, they saved money. Then you had shutdowns, and they switched from arbitrary high rates to auctions so they get the power at lower rates. So here we go through all these different definitions of biomass electricity, and this is happening only just a few years. Then one of the things that we noticed once they were there, we noticed there were some advantages. Now, biomass electric has disadvantages, but since there's so little of it left, we don't need to talk about those anymore. But one of the advantages we realized was these are much more stable fuel prices than our fossil fuels. We had oil price spikes from time to time, natural gas price spikes. And one of the metaphors we heard back when the last time oil was really high was the school principals were saying, I have to throw my teachers into the boiler to keep this place hot. And so we had teachers being thrown into the furnace. We had to cut the budget for teachers to pay for our fuel bills. Then when oil was at $100, biomass is all of a sudden a cheaper fuel. That's now cheaper, whether it's in your wood stove at home or whether it's in a biomass power plant. But more stable prices, cheaper. And for a long time early on, it was better than coal. Biomass is better than coal. Well, now that's kind of gone away because we have basically zero coal in the main fuel mix. As we saw this very large industry, a lot of private investment in the wood supply chain was made, and it was clear that biomass electric plants supported the supply chain for all of the wood industries in a variety of ways that we could go into in greater details if we had time. It did provide local jobs and tax base. Again, as I said, it was never intended for this. We didn't set this up, all of these biomass plants, in order to do it, but that's what happened. Also, there was a hope that, well, we could use the waste heat. Obviously, they're inefficient, all the waste heat, but we've been doing that for 30 years and people are still trying. So it really seems to be very hard to make use of it. And it's a fortunate thing because they've turned out to be such unreliable sources of power with the fluctuating utility policies that anybody investing to use the waste heat would probably regret it. I understand over at Burgess in New Hampshire, there's an effort underway there to make use of waste heat. If there are others around, I don't know of them. And another thing that turned out to be an advantage is when these first came, everyone was expecting that they would be biomassing stands of trees and running them into the power plant. But in fact, many of these plants were running only 30 or 40% on biomass straight out of the forest. And a lot of their raw material was other sources. It was urban wood waste, it was construction and demolition waste and everything. And many of these were yard waste. This is waste that was oftentimes a true waste where the people could get paid to take it away and then paid to deliver it. So you got paid at both ends. So there were all these advantages that people sort of discovered as this began to be fully developed. And that's the reason why there's been a lot of public policy dispute and debate about whether we should, in quotes, subsidize these plants to keep them running at a time of really cheap natural gas, or whether we should just shut them down. Now, then there are a number more definitions. For a time, everybody remember the Carter administration, we wanted energy independence, the moral equivalent of war. So now local fuel, whether it was coal, whether it was biomass, was better than Arab oil. So that was another definition that came along. It came and it went after a while. And then it became cheaper again when we had our more recent $100 bouts of $100 oil. Again, once oil prices receded and once natural gas prices receded, many of these plants were not dispatched as much. And we had what's called renewable portfolio standards showing up. Different state legislatures saying the utilities have to have so and so much renewable power in their power mix. And this generated what are called RECs, which is a market for a transferable kind of certificate that guaranteed that a certain amount of electricity was from either hydropower or biomass. And then, of course, the debate was, well, biomass isn't renewable or biomass is. And I was actually sitting in the office of a buyer from one of those biomass plants who was calling his supplier saying he couldn't take their material anymore because the state of Connecticut had just canceled it from their RECs program, which was an example of how you rely on public policy at your peril in a lot of these industries. And when public policy changes, your supply chain changes. So now there's quite a perception again that with cheaper natural gas, with the environmental issues, biomass is the work of the devil. And there are organizations involved just saying, well, it should just be abolished. But what they look like now is zombies on life support. And we've had these periodic debates in several of the northeastern states. How can we keep them alive with subsidies from other sources just to keep them there because of these advantages I was telling you about. So right now, though, they pretty much look like zombies on life support. There are many mysteries about this. I was skiing the other day and both Livermore and Stratton seem to be running. I see the steam coming out of their stacks. So are they past history? We don't really know. Just sort of as a last way to close up this story, this is an industry created by public policy. It was not created to reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. It wasn't created as a development program, although it was very successful in doing that for a while. But it went on a roller coaster of changing public policy priorities, of utility restructuring. When these plants were built, we didn't have a competitive market in power that crossed state lines, that flowed power from place to place through a grid. We now do. Changing competing fuels, we have natural gas driving the price of wholesale electricity and cheap natural gas because of fracking, which has its own issues. Whole new issues coming up, and now we're concerned about how CO2 intensive is it compared to other assumed sources of the same energy. So since the peak, this has been an industry under what I'll just call Chinese water torture. It's gone from 10 or 12 plants to 2 or 3. Some of them not operating very often, some of them gone. And I would just caution that whether you were looking at this from the standpoint of the late 70s against Seabrook Power or today looking at it from CO2, every problem is simple if you measure it against one number. Every problem is real simple. If you have a set of agreed upon alternatives as to what would the world be like if we did something different. And I think we've got to keep that in mind when we think about all of these aspects of carbon neutrality, that every problem is simple if you boil it down to one number. So I think it's an interesting history. And it does show, I think maybe a cautionary note that sometimes the world changes out from under us and our public policy assumptions that might have been sound at one time can become either out of date or unsound as the world changes. And this may not be the last time it ever happens. So we're run through a lot of material pretty fast, but there's backup for it available. It will be available on the website. I don't know if you want to offer any comments or outbursts or suggestions or questions at this point, or just move on.
Let's take a minute to ask questions or comments. Lloyd, but maybe I'll start with one. Can you or anybody remind me what happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago in the LePage administration? Wasn't there was a subsidy of biomass plants? I want to remember. It's like $13 million. What was up with that? Why did that happen?
There were several of them, and I think the reason it happened was because we had this huge upsurge of fracking oil and gas production. It drove down the price of natural gas, and it drove down the wholesale price of electricity. Mm-hmm. And I've got the charts in one of those documents I sent you, to the point that these plants just simply couldn't get their product dispatched anymore. They weren't running. They were going on they were originally given 20-year contracts at very rich prices, and then those went away. And instead, they had to sell their power on 6-month blocks. So a power plant would be up for 6 months because it sold its power. Then it would be down. It would be up. It would be down. And increasingly, the competition for cheap natural gas was just putting them out of business. And in fact, the Pilgrim nuclear power plant in Massachusetts is being dismantled now because it can't compete with cheap natural gas. Yeah. So this is just a problem of the biomass business. But there was a USDA program, which I think everybody remember that biomass program, Jake and Ken, some of you that were involved in this. It was just ridiculous. It was the dumbest thing I ever heard of. It was to create incentives for using biomass for fuel. And then there was the state, which went through several rounds, and the state of New Hampshire did too, of trying to find ways to just give them money to keep them alive. And that was because the local employment, the tax bases, the impact on the supply chain. I would like to write this all up so that we could sort of see the whole picture with all the things I didn't get time to talk about. But yeah, there were efforts, and it was basically because natural gas is really cheap right now.
Other questions, comments?
I have a question. I'm wondering if anybody knows for sure how many of the standalone, not combined heat and power, but the standalone generating plants are still operating, not ones that are connected to paper mills.
Do you have something on that, Danny?
I think there's just 2 left. One is in Lisbon Falls and the other is in Stratton.
That's what I thought. I thought that most of the independent ones had closed up.
Well, those are independent. They're owned by a hedge fund in New York.
Yeah, no, I mean independent in the sense that all they do is produce electricity. They don't have any combined heat and power, or they're not connected to a paper mill.
Standalone
waste.
And I'm told that even one of the biggest biomass users, kind of invisible to most of us, one of the biggest biomass users in the state was Sappi up there at Somerset at Hinkley. And I'm told that they're burning a lot of coal now.
Really?
That's what I'm told. It's hard to find this information.
Yeah.
Kind of irritating, but it should be more transparent and more readily available than this. And one thing that's really hard is to find out what the prices are for all of these things. But no one wants to talk about it. Either the buyers nor the sellers, nor the intermediaries. It's really hard. So if you're trying to be one of the worriers like I am and trying to make some estimates of what prices of things are going to be in the future, it's a challenge.
Another point is, I mentioned this before, but I think I'm correct in that most of the, quote, renewable energy from biomass that is accepted under the renewable portfolio standard in Maine comes from the paper mills. They generate about 90% of that electricity. So the other players, are really small. Are you nodding your head there, Lloyd? Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that's right. And that's another one of the kind of invisible things. I think they even under some of these programs, they either got tax breaks or something as a result of doing that. And most of that, some of this from cogen for buying in biomass from their own operations from other places, and some of it's from burning their so-called black liquor that emerges from their digesters. And I have a hard time with some of that business of calling that renewable energy, because they were doing that long ago when they first invented the craft process. They do it for 3 reasons. They do it to recover their chemicals so they can put them back into the process. They do it to reduce their pollution. and they do it for the heat. So they have real good reasons for that, for consuming that stuff internally as a part of the process, to the point that craft pulp has largely driven other methods of making pulp out of the market, because it's just the most overall cost-efficient way to do it.
I think they were able to change that that traditional practice into something that qualified under quote it's part of the renewable portfolio standard, class 1 renewable energy certificates.
Well, I think
and they had to commit to make a certain dollar amount of capital investment to upgrade the facility. If they did that, then they were grandfathered in. Whether that was legitimate or not, who knows? But the PUC sprinkled holy water on it, and that's where we are now.
Well, I hope this has been an interesting little portrait of very stylized of a kind of long and tortured history. But here we are. We've gone from, say, 12 plants down to 2, but there's an awful lot of very different avenues where biomass goes into energy one way or another. We heard about a little bit of that last time. So at least I'm glad to be able to lay a little bit of this story out for you, just for your general interest.
So
We ready, Jake?
I was going to.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Si, is that you? Are you talking?
I was going to say it's interesting that Robbins just brought a plant online last year.
Yeah, but that's
yeah,
combined heat and
Right.
power.
That's right, but it's like the paper mills, and they went through the effort of adding a brand new plant to do that.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that remark, Si, because are you hearing me?
Yes.
It turns out I discovered. In fact, I think Drew put me onto this. The University of Maine has a big grant and has some people in the engineering department, which is going to be doing a lot of work on CHP and feasibility, where it's applicable, where it's not. And since it was a point of some contention within the governor's council, I don't know whether our group would want to learn a little bit more about it, but maybe we could get a 15-minute talk by somebody like that. Maybe get somebody from Robbins, or I understand the fellows up at Athens, they're at the pellet plant are doing CHP, to inform us a little bit better on it. We may not want a whole session, but I would like to know a little bit more about it. Where is that likely to go? Where was it likely to be applicable? Where is it not? We can talk about that. John, would you try to remember to remind us of that when you talk about what we should do next?
Absolutely.
Lloyd, is that part of the DoD grant? Do you know?
I don't remember where they got the money, but they're awful good at bringing in the money up there, and they've got
Yeah.
some couple of people that are going to spend a lot of time on CHP. So we'll have some local experts that we can talk to on this, and
Yeah.
we'll give them a chance to let us know what they think. Okay,
Yep.
I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, Jake.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me take a look at talk about some of the stuff I've been looking at. Again, I just wanted to highlight that I'm not a researcher. I'm, as John has now dubbed me, a data nerd. And in having these discussions, had some questions and tried to go find some data to help figure out if I could come up with any answers on my own. And of course, you're going to get to the end and realize that I didn't come up with any answers, but probably we'll all have more questions. And so basically this is looking at a lot of different data that made sense to me and has been talked through and reviewed and fixed several times by Ken and John and Lloyd. Especially early on, I had some conversion issues. And so I think I've got it all figured out now, but anyway, this is where we're headed. So, when I started listening in on these discussions and all the carbon talk this spring, we were all talking about Maine's forest as if it was just one entity that didn't have any differences in terms of the different carbon qualities of the wood or all sorts of things. So I figured there's got to be some information out there that is going to help me understand the differences, or maybe there are differences in the forest types that we're harvesting, that we're processing, that we can somehow pick apart to see if we target some silvicultural practices or landowner incentives towards, it might make a more major difference than if we just kind of say generically, let's do this for Maine's forest. And so this is kind of why I went down this rabbit hole, is that we talk about Maine's forest as a one unit, but it's really not. And, you know, we all know that, but still it's important to try to remember that, especially when we get deep into these equations of conversions of different components. So that led me to think, okay, where is there a good source of publicly available data for those of us that aren't looking at this as our primary job? This is a hobby effort, if you will. And that was the Maine Forest Service reports on wood processing and harvesting and whatnot over the last about 20 years that's housed online. And then Ken opened the door to a little more long range data. And so that's what I was looking at when I went down this rabbit hole, like I said. So would there be inefficiencies somewhere, whether in what's growing out there or what we're processing, that we could somehow tweak that would capture this more beneficial carbon management, or stick with business as usual? And again, going the next step is, okay, if everything else is equal, do we focus our effort on trying to manage more carbon dense wood to somehow speed up our ability to store more and capture more in our forests? So here we go. This is a complex table that I've shared early on, and this is what started driving this for me, is looking at what emissions goals we had as a state defined in different areas. This legislative mandate goal that we'd reduce emissions from 1990 levels 80% by 2050, and then the executive order goal that we'd be carbon neutral by 2045, and combined information from different sources on where we stood now from the forest, and how do we turn current into future through some sort of climate helpful management. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out here, is where would we target these activities in our current forest to try to make those gains. So Ken provided this information. Here's just all our harvest levels normalized to green tons over time. You can see that in this most recent 25 to 30 years or so, we peaked, and now we're in a decline. And so we'll jump into that red box area more for where all this stands. So from Ken's data, you can see overall harvest levels down. However, hardwood harvest is almost flatline over the last 30 years or so. Softwood is down a little bit, and the biomass, which is unallocated to any particular species, is on the rise. So that's the first thing, is that, okay, so hardwood even, softwood down, and biomass as a product is kind of growing. Splitting that more to the individual components over the last 60 years, again from Ken's data archive, which is the Forest Service archive, you can see that softwood saw logs are down here. They've had a peak, and then they're basically, if you, over the term of the whole thing, about a little bit more than they have been traditionally in the farther past. Hardwood logs pretty steady. Hardwood pulp I think, as we all know, has gained a lot in the more recent times, and softwood pulp has really fallen off.
Jake, would you be able to just identify the colors? It's hard to read the.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Dark green is the softwood saw logs. Light green is softwood pulp. Dark orange is hardwood saw logs, and light orange is the hardwood pulp. And for most of these graphs, I tried to stick with the dark green is softwood and orange is hardwood as we move forward too. So that's interesting to see that, you know, the pulp is driving a lot of the harvest. Hardwood pulp is a lot of it more recently, but overall they're pretty steady through time. More recently, same information, different shorter time frame. Hardwood logs here at the bottom, pretty flat. Softwood pulp, flat for a while and dipped in the last 5 or 10 years. Softwood saw logs, both of these saw log lines take that big dip in the mid 2000s where we had the recession, and then hardwood pulp here. So again, all of this is what has been harvested by product and type. And here again, shorter time frame, highlighting that a little more specifically to say, okay, what's really happened recently? What's going on? And again, biomass has come up, that's the blue line. And the rest of these are, as I previously described, as kind of just plugging along, no real major shifts that I saw. Again, I'm not a statistician. I didn't do any analysis to see how much of a difference these are over time. I'm just looking, this is one little bit of what I was looking at to try to figure out if anything jumped out. You know, if these are wild swings up and down, to see how volatile these markets were, because it's not something that I pay attention to regularly. But it is, I think, going to be insightful to figure out if there's anything that we can focus on.
Jake?
Yes.
Jake, an observation. A couple of people, I think in our sessions a while ago, were expressing astonishment that there seemed to be so much room to increase softwood harvests in Maine, because it just didn't seem to click with what they understood to be going on. But if you take a close look at this, what we see is we're in our minds, we have 2000 to 2005, but what we see is a tremendous reduction in softwood pulpwood, and 2017 was their base year. They said we could increase a certain amount from 2017, and here saw logs have hardly recovered from the recession, just the slightest bit. Softwood pulp hasn't recovered at all and maybe won't. So this is what this chart is telling us, is that our perceptions of how much harvesting has been going on based on what we think of as normal back here pre-recession have changed a lot. And what's this, though? It's the market side of things that has given us room for a boost in production.
For sure. And, you know, again, I think it's insightful to realize that one of the biggest thing that we are harvesting in Maine's forest is not softwood pulp, which is what we, you know, many of us have thought through time is the big driver. It's this hardwood pulp, and by significant amount, 2 to 1 over the softwood pulp, and just the inverse for softwood saw logs are 2 to 1 over hardwood saw logs. And so that's what shows up there. Just as a percentage of total harvest, biomass is about 20%, and that hardwood, biomass 20%, pulpwood, both types in the middle, about 50, and saw logs 30, which is all information that Ken has shown you various ways through time. But again, I was interested to see how much jumping up and down there is here, and it all matches with what we saw on those other graphs. So I don't expect you to be able to read this I show it for illustrative purposes. This is a depiction of all the products by type and by forest type, and the difference between what was harvested in the state and what was processed in the state. So if the box is green, that means there was more grown in the state than there was harvested. Processed, excuse me. And so, for example, and I'll run through these in more detail, you can see a lot of the saw log products we're growing more than we're processing in the state. And on the pulpwood down at the bottom, we are processing a lot more than we're growing here in the state, and very much so in the hardwoods. That's pretty much all being imported. I mean, there's a big difference in the import versus what we're growing here. So the mills want more than we have available for them. So by product, the other thing I wanted to note is the scale of these things, to see, is something dominant equal to some other, are the softwood saw logs much more than what we're selling or processing in softwood pulpwood. So what we're seeing here is that, orders of magnitude more saw logs of spruce fir are being sent out of state than it can be processed in the state. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go forward. But all the rest of the things that we are producing more of than are being processed here are not nearly the scale as the spruce fir saw logs. Again, everything's normalized to green tons because that then easily can convert to carbon and CO2 equivalents. And these are the high value products. So landowners are selling more than can be processed here in the state of these high value products. And the mills are consistently importing the pine, birch, and aspen, still not on the magnitude of the spruce fir, but they're growing more than, they're processing more than they are getting from the main landowners. And then again, pulp trumps all of that by a large portion. So we are not producing the pulp in the state that the mills need. And so it's an interesting look to think about that for a second. So then, okay, products is one thing, but really what this boils down to is, what do we have for species growing in the state that could possibly be a focus for carbon management in a way that kind of changes the equation? And so when you look at just all products by species, again, some trends emerge. Spruce fir, we're growing way more than we can process in the state, but aspen and kind of generic other hardwood is being imported by those mills, like we said before. Most everything else in the hardwood side, we're growing, but we don't have mills to process. So by species, again, spruce fir dominates, but these others are also in surplus in terms of landowners have it and they have to find mills somewhere to process it. Whereas these species, the mills want it and have to go somewhere and find it. And so that's, again, the scale we're talking about here for all of these is, let me go back to this one. So spruce and fir was the biggest at 658,000 green tons over what is processed in the state. But you can see these others, between the aspen and the pines, those add up to about the same. And then you have the hardwood that's also dominating the import. So in general, main harvest more softwood than is processed in the state, but then is consistently importing hardwood to fill the mill needs. And overall, across all the species, when you add up all those different things, we're still importing 755,000 tons of material to meet the mill demand. And again, that's dominated by the pulp and biomass that these mills are bringing in. And I don't have individual mill numbers, but I do have some information that is going to help describe why that might be. So at first, I was thinking that these differences in numbers were being driven by kind of what do we have available for these mills and for these landowners. But after Peter T's talk, I followed up with him, and he helped illuminate a couple more things to make it clear that I hadn't thought about, because again, my day job is land conservation and not market analysis. Is that where the markets are drive these numbers for the landowners more than anything else. And so it's not necessarily the case that they wouldn't sell the wood that they have available to those mills so that they wouldn't have to import it from out of state. It's just that it's too far away. And that these mills have large wood baskets based on where they're located, which many of us know. And so they're going to pull more wood from out of state than in state, even if the wood is available in the state. And so my example there is that if you have all sorts of hardwood pulp in Fort Kent, it's not going to go to Skowhegan, but there might be some hardwood that comes from some subdivision cleared in Massachusetts that could find its way to Skowhegan. And so that's going to drive the numbers quite a bit, because ultimately I was looking for solution or potential solutions that are not going to hamstring the mills, because we know we could just stop cutting a certain amount of wood each year and accomplish the goals, but that negates the goals that we all, many of us have on making sure that these mills stay relatively competitive and well, as good employers and strong economic drivers. And so I don't want to hamstring the mills by anything that I would come up with in this analysis. I wanted to assess if there were some other inefficiencies to tackle. So that drove me to look at the maps of where these mills are. And so I just, using some known information about where the major mills are, put those on the Google map to show that, I talked about exporting a lot of spruce fir saw logs. Well, that's because, it's because there's a lot of big mills, as we know, right outside Maine that'll accept those logs, whereas there's very few, the ones in Maine are on the outside, some go this way, but a lot go this way. So that drives why the exports are so high there, in my opinion. And then pulp mills are blue. They're super far away. I know that there's hardwood pulp that goes out this way as well. But a lot of this pulpwood here has nowhere to go. So it's going to stay there in the woods for the landowners, as opposed to coming way down here to Sappi or other locations. And then, the hardwood saw logs, there's only a couple, and they're a far ride from some of these locations. So that seeing that visually, helps inform some of those numbers as well. And then here's the southern part of the state, and you can see that the types of mills change. The blue dots are the pulp mills. The green are white pine mills. And so obviously we talked about them importing a lot of logs from out of state. And of course that makes sense because they're in the southern half of the state. So they're going to pull from all these locations out here in addition to what's in Maine. So it started to make more sense in my mind that we didn't have, it's not so much that the wood balance to mill balance was driven by landowner decisions, more where those markets are is what's really driving some of these things.
Well, it's
So-
also, it's also interesting that it's driven by price. We can talk about.
Oh, for sure.
And a lot of the wood that comes in from the south is a backhaul. Those trucks go down loaded with lumber and come back with logs.
Yep.
So you see the same with Canada. So it's a very interesting factor in this that they can haul relatively inexpensively because it's a backhaul.
Right. Right. It otherwise would be expensive to bring it by itself, but if it's that versus or an empty trailer, then this works. Yeah. No, and this is just the one more tip of the iceberg in terms of data analysis and looking at some of this stuff. And I'm not trying to explain all the factors by simple boiling it down here, because there's just way more than I have to go into. That we know that all this stuff, people do weird things for various reasons, and price is number one. So that brought me to the point of, okay, here's lots of information. Where do we go from here? Is any of this useful in knowing how much those we have that we're sending out of state versus what we're processing in state? And can we combine that knowledge with our knowledge of what we have for inventory and the things we've talked about with potential silviculture and carbon markets to try to match up some of these things to those different forest types, to try to come up with some sort of recommendations, I guess is the best way. Are there practices that we can promote to landowners, to other foresters, to say, hey, if you could do X, Y, and Z for your spruce fir stands, that'd be, and either get paid for it or know that you'll get paid for it more in the future, but minimize the effect on the main mills. That might be something worth promoting. Now, I'm ignoring leakage for the time being in terms of the big carbon equation in the sky, but I'm just looking at what we can try to do for actionable things here in Maine to try to enhance what we're trying to accomplish statewide, and then grow that outwards. And again, I'm not suggesting, when I say incentivize management for landowners, I'm not saying the traditional carbon market type where you're trying to calculate what was there last year, what's there this year, and high carbon accounting exercise. It's more, could we target landowners that have a certain amount of forest type on their land and incentivize specific management of those types of stands to try to gain in places where we know we could gain. So back to the original chart, in order to get to neutrality based on the current numbers, we need to gain, if we maintain an emissions level of about 17.5 million metric tons of CO2 each year, then there's a gap for where we want to go of about 5.2 million metric tons. And so how do we get there? Like I said, there's capacity in the woods based on these numbers to just come up with that. However, that's going to come at a cost to mills and landowners don't necessarily need to be the ones that bear the brunt of this. And so is there a way to come up with that combo? So are there ways to focus on some of these things? Do these long-term trends of net imports mean that we can even change our practices in a way that would reduce Maine's overall harvest? Is that impractical to even think about? Getting back to Bob Seymour's talk about changing silviculture so we grow more on each acre, maybe that is just the way to go. And then in the end, my original question of, should we focus on oak or yellow birch because it's more carbon dense than spruce fir? Does that even matter at the scales we're talking about? So that's really it. No answers here, and I will share again with John the bigger table so you can all dive into each of those yearly numbers all in one place if you want. But it was an interesting thought exercise to run through those statewide data, try to figure out, is there consistency in some of these products and species? And the answer is yes. But taking that next step is above my thought capacity and why we're having this groupthink discussion. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to highlight today. I do have a couple more slides that show kind of the current status of what's on the ground out here using TNC's resilient land mapping tool. And that's something that I think Mark highlighted in one of our talks earlier. If not, it was in another talk. It's an interesting website where you can go. They have some background research on forest cover types and have assigned or calculated how much carbon there is on each acre throughout most of Maine. And so I zoomed around the state and did some quick polygon creation of areas that I knew and saw, and tried to figure out what are we talking about in terms of scale of different properties. And what you see generally is that there's a mix, obviously. Just because it's in reserve status doesn't mean that it has any more than managed stand, and some of the managed stands that are managed very well doesn't necessarily mean that they have more than the TIMO managed land. And these are just a snapshot in time and averaged over, a couple thousand acres. But it was just interesting to me to see how this fit into the equation too. And again, I picked areas that I knew relatively well, although the place I picked in southern Maine was just a random spot outside Scarborough. But all the rest show generally what trend you would think. However, I'm not an expert on this data, and so I don't want to say that this is the be all end all of all spruce fir is only at 100 tons of carbon per acre versus all reserves are at 125 or more. But as it relates to, okay, is there capacity for the species, the areas to give us more? I think it shows that probably there is. And so matching that with ways to help the landowner keep it there and grow it more, I think may be a way to start to target, it's possible that targeted work with specific forest types in specific areas might be a helpful way to get at this problem. And then finally, we've talked about this, but every solution has a yeah but component. And so maybe the way we have to change our thinking on this is start at the Maine level, and then you work to New England and US and North America and then around the world, because otherwise you'll never, I feel like we're never going to get out of the equation of, yeah, but what about this? Or, leakage, if we don't cut the wood in Maine, it's going to get cut somewhere else. I think that's part of the equation that we have to think about, but also might hamstring us in finding good solutions that are realistic. So that's my final slide. So I will stop sharing here and take any questions, although it's, again, the questions are for all of us, not just for me.
Hey, I had a question on your what you stated as the goal. My understanding is we're currently emitting around 17 million metric tons of CO2.
Yep.
The Climate Council has committed to reduce emissions by by 80% by just reducing the emissions.
Right.
So that gets you
Avoid
down
being in the
to
house, because I knew you had
emissions
a
of
car.
around 3 million or so, depending on 20, maybe 3 to 5 million. And so that makes the 2050 goal, but then the governor said we can get to carbon neutral by 2045 using natural solutions. So I've always thought that the goal for the natural solutions was 3 to 4 million metric tons. And right now, the normal situation is we're sequestering 12 million tons annually. So to me, the problem is like, it's sort of solved in a way, as long as we can hang on to the 12 million tons or a portion of it.
Right.
Am I misunderstanding or would people chime in and see if I'm
No,
not-
I think you are right. Is that if we can hit the emissions goals, that's the easiest way to solve this thing for Maine. But I don't know that that's realistic, and so that's why I mean, I think yeah, I'm showing this. This is what I came up with before, where these are our emission levels. This is the 1990 emission level. We wanted to get to 80% of that, which is the which is 4.3. And so, yeah, if we get down that far, that'd be awesome. And we cross over, and we'd be a sink at some point if we hit those emissions goals.
They kind of stated differently. I don't think the Climate Council would permit natural system offsets for more than 3 to 5 million. They're trying to force the industrial and other users to cut the emissions. So
Right.
what we're expecting out of the forest is this lower number, I think.
Yeah, and I mean that'd be great, but if that's it took for me, it's I was trying to view it from, I don't trust that we're going to get down that far. And that, I think that's part of what this discussion group is about, is how can the forest even enhance beyond what the Climate Council is asking for.
Well, and remember what Jake, help me remind what and Ken too. What you're showing is a net growth over harvest that has
Right.
been. So, and remember what Peter T said a month ago, if I recall correctly, it was to double harvest. So the industry is headed towards being more aggressive on the harvesting end. Isn't that what we heard?
But also with a higher inventory.
Well, right. So they got to grow more, right? Where silviculture comes into play. But anyway, my point was that there may not be this continued excess of over harvest,
Sure.
the way Peter was talking about going from 8 billion to 12 billion in the forest industry.
Right.
I had a thought when the Climate Council came out first, it sounded to me like they were doing it backwards. They said, let's set a goal and then let's figure out whether we get there. It usually seems to figure out whether you get there. It should have something to do with setting the goal. Now, when I read deeper into the working papers that were done, there was some very detailed forecasts done about the overall energy balance of the state. And from what I took away from that material, the goal, in fact, can't be met. It's just not possible, at least according to this set of analysts. And I looked very quickly through the Climate Council's overall report. They didn't seem to want to talk about that very much. No one wanted to, these people were kind of like, oh, well, we hired you, but please go away. Let's not talk about this. That does have some implications, it seems to me. And I wonder if Evan is still with us here, if that question came up at all as the Climate Council was converging on its report. What about those people? Did they decide they didn't believe the consultants or what?
Yeah, so I wasn't in the room a lot of times for some of the development, but you're right. The original, some of this had to do with the timetable they were on. The ERG group that did the modeling, and forget the name of the other group. The original modeling fell short by a certain amount that is what you saw, and then we're asked to kind of go back to the table to figure out what a glide path looks like that gets to the targets. And so my understanding, there's more modeling that will be taking place this year by those same groups to assess that. But you're right. I mean, right now, those are obviously really ambitious transformations. And I think my impression has been that, you know, all hands on deck, if we can use the forest to get to carbon neutrality, which, as Denny points out, is probably not a big lift. Great. If we can go beyond that, then there's some that feel like, well, that's potentially an economic benefit to the state. And it's good to understand what that potential is, because our ability to meet the targets is, of course, really dubious from the standpoint of even the original modeling. So that's kind of what I know about it. There was some discussion, but it was like 11th hour by the time we were going back to look at questions about how to meet the targets compared to the original modeling that was done, and hopefully more of that takes place. But we as a whole council have not sat around and had this discussion per se. So you were in the room for a lot of the natural working lands discussions around this, and then there was not as much focus on it given the time that existed. So if that's helpful, that's kind of my perspective on where it's at.
I have another question for Jake, and that is, after you went through this, you actually reemerged from the rabbit hole on this thing. Did any of what you saw surprise you? Is there anything you didn't expect that you found out after you did this?
I mean, I don't know about didn't. I mean, I learned a lot because, like I said, I don't pay close attention to the scale of some of these things, but to know that we have, the landowners are, you know, sending a lot of, you know, how clear it was that the pattern is steady through time in almost all of these categories, no matter how you split it up. You know, softwood saw logs, I mean, spruce fir saw logs are consistently a very big seller and exported by basically the same magnitude every year. That gave me hope in that if we, whoever the we is, the state, this group, the Forest Service, whatever, came up with any sort of recommendation to manage for carbon as a product, it could be geared to a certain specific species and or current market that has a little inefficiency because these are so consistent through time. You know, for the last 20 years, they've been at a certain scale. They're not just up and down, always positive. They're really pretty steady, positive or negative. You know, it's clear that those markets are that are there, and the volumes that they're requiring have been relatively steady over that course of that time frame. And I should say that the chart I showed had 20 years worth of data, but the numbers on the individual slides about where the trends were the last about 10 years worth, which is the more recent after a bunch of different mills have gone offline. And so even then, they still are pretty consistent. So it's just interesting on that scale that these aren't jumping around as much as you think of when you hear headlines about, you know, volatility in the markets. The landowners are pretty consistent and the mills are pretty consistent, you know, when you lump it at this scale.
I guess I have a question for anybody. My brain can't figure this out. To what extent is this main boundary just an arbitrary geographic unit? If things are moving across state boundaries and ending up in the atmosphere or not, no matter whether they cross the boundary or not. So what is the real way to reduce the impact on the atmosphere, irrespective of how stuff is moving across boundaries? Jake, you were starting to get at this, I think, in your presentation, because some of us view the atmosphere as the one whole atmosphere, never mind what Maine wants to do with carbon neutrality.
Sure.
So, I mean, it
Yep.
becomes a shell game at some point. So
Right.
what are we going to do?
Well, the key is the price. The key is the price. If carbon suddenly begins to have real economic value as a forest product, then it will begin to compete with all the other forest products. And whoever wants it more will pay more for it. It sounds way too simple, but it's going to have a major impact upon this.
Yeah.
The other thing to build up on that is that it's not just forest remaining as forest, right? But then because they're going to be competing with agriculture and developed land and other things, right? It can also make carbon as a commodity more valuable for even other land.
Right.
So you have less pressure either to convert, or you have more incentive to basically expand.
Right. And I mean, the policy in my mind should be to make people basically as aware as possible. It's almost a marketing thing where you try to, because landowners are so confused, as we are confused, and it will take a while to sort things out. But if we can have the ability to really try to let land managers and landowners and mill owners, of course, know what the actual competitive prices are. And it's one of the problems with locking things up forever. It's all very well to say we want to hold carbon, but maybe not have the price set so that people could move around. It's fascinating from a forestry standpoint, especially with smaller ownerships, to try to do landscape management for something like wildlife. Is just because every landowner is doing something different, you wind up with this wonderful mix that tends to work pretty well. And I think price is going to have a major impact on this over time.
This is Denny. On the price, the price is a function of government regulation. So it's a question of how tight the government wants to put the caps, on to drive down carbon emissions. And I just would mention that in the European market, the Bank of England warned banks to be expecting a carbon price of $100 a ton in the very near future, and to plan for that. Now, if we get to $100 a ton for carbon, you won't have any wood supply coming out because it won't be able to compete with $100 a ton. And
that's not true, Denny.
Okay.
So that's not true. So because prices for demand for timber will still go up, prices will go up, so it'll still compete. So at least analysis that I have done.
Oh, so the timber supply will just need to come on by meeting that higher price.
So we'll be paying more for wood products.
And then over the long run, it's actually potentially could go down because it's going to incentivize all this management will actually have excess wood.
Okay.
Yeah.
You need to recall that the major metric being measured is where carbon is being sequestered, not where it is being harvested or where it is being processed. So as long as our inventory stays steady, it doesn't matter how much we cut or where it goes. It's the inventory that we need to keep an eye on.
And maybe increase it, which I know Adam and Aaron and others are I mean, to me, and somehow we want to grow more wood per unit area. If we get more of those photons producing wood, right? Don't we? Isn't that one of that may be the price can go up, but we'd really like to store more wood, both on the land and in product. And that requires investment in silviculture. Adam, you got any? Yeah, I know you agree with me on that. Which people are working.
And again,
yeah. Go ahead.
That's one of the things I was trying to get at is trying to balance different parts of this equation being not to hamper what the mills currently want with, can we boost up landowners' incentives to grow more on the acres and not send it out? And trying to figure out where is there an inefficiency there or not, to help target where we ask or will realistically find landowners interested in growing more per acre, and make that work. And it may just shake out naturally as the landowner base changes. You know, I know of several that have changed over the last couple of years that are not going to be cutting at the rates that the previous landowner did. And so the inventory may jump on its own without us having to incentivize anything. And we'll see it play out in the numbers in the next few years, or as our efforts to conserve lands and add more reserves out there on the landscape, that those come online. You know, those are all formerly managed lands, and those are just growing, you know, and so eventually that stuff's going to start to get pulled into the FIA and other inventory efforts to be acknowledged in this big equation.
And I still am trying to reconcile. I need to read the 4 main report. I admit I haven't yet, but what Peter T was talking about last time with us and the significant increase in the forest products industry, you know, where's that coming from? Where's that going to come from? And I guess it's partly the wall of wood coming after the budworm bounce back. But anyway, the industry seems like it's going to grow, or intends to grow, right? Isn't that it's what I remember anyway.
Right.
So.
Right, and then you can have this debate of what are the forest products and do they count as sequestered wood once they're processed?
Mm-hmm.
How much of it counts as sequestered once it's processed?
Right.
There's some kind of intriguing things that go on in the marketplace that connect to this. They just sort of happen that way. But when I was growing up in forestry school, aspen either wasn't used for anything or was used for pulp. Well, now we have 2 mills in Maine that are using aspen for a building board kind of product that's going to be tied up in a house for a long time. And so in a way, the aspen has transitioned from nothing to a pulpwood product to a product that stores carbon in the downstream, the harvested wood products and everything. And we've seen a lot of that on the softwood side too. The spruce fir, some of us can remember a time when the pulp mills were using almost all of it. And then gradually the sawmills started to work their way down in terms of the sizes of wood they could use, to the point that here you had pulp mills trying to buy stud wood, but they couldn't afford to pay stud wood prices for material between 5 and 8 inches, 10 inches in diameter. The logs got shorter. And so you had a market process of moving wood from the pulpwood pile into a sawmill, where a significant part of that would become a long-term stored product. And that's just the changes in the markets and the technology compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. It's an intriguing set of stories that are related to the charts that Jake was telling us.
Right. I mean, part of that was the fact that you had the budworm epidemic in 1918, and that wood came through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and in the 60s, all of a sudden it was big enough to be a saw log. And that's when the sawmill industry really boomed in Maine, or began to boom. I can remember arguing with woodland managers where we had beautiful spruce log stands, and they said, we grow pulpwood, by God, you know, and over the course of 3 or 4 years, beginning to suddenly produce saw logs that were, you know, that went from an undersupply of wood to an oversupply of wood, and then along came budworm. So it goes back and forth.
So one of the things you brought up, Cy, relative to products, and we've talked about it here, and obviously everyone knows it's important and knows more about it than me, but the time frame for all of this is really important. We can't increase carbon standing on the land forever. So we're talking really about a one-time trajectory that contributes to greenhouse gas sequestration till you reach some carbon saturation of the landscape.
Yes. Yes, yes.
You also probably have saturation of the market, but I have no idea what that is. Maybe we'll recarpet the American landscape with CLT buildings. And so this will go on for 200 years. But the most important time for the contribution is the next several decades when we're, really behind the 8 ball. And so thinking about the timeline for sort of all of these processes and trends and some of the, the time series that you showed, Jake, it's really what happens now in the next few decades that's most critical. And, I don't know a lot about it. I don't know about energy that much. As I look at some of the other state plans a little bit, I'm, for example, New Jersey is I think looking to biomass energy after 2050, once it's weaned itself off of natural gas in its trajectory to try to address the greenhouse gas concerns. So no take home there, except there's a finite amount of carbon we can put on the landscape. And so we're not talking about the new way Maine's going to do things for 200 years. I mean, maybe, but very slowly. If we're really good at it, we'll reach saturation. And the timeline is what gets us in trouble. For example, with bioenergy, when is it carbon neutral? It's not carbon neutral in the next 20 years. It's carbon neutral after 100 years or 200 years. So I think and the modelers, of which many of you have expertise, but as I watch some of the discussions in the council as well, don't include a discussion of the time frame often enough so that people are tracking where the carbon's going. Because ultimately, right, it's what the atmosphere sees, and most critically, what the atmosphere sees in the near term. And are the differences big enough for, Jake, you talked about the carbon density of the different woods, and is that enough to matter? There's albedo, if we go hardwoods versus softwoods, it's not a carbon factor, but it is a greenhouse gas or a warming factor, a meteorological concern. So anyway, just a couple thoughts as I was hearing another great discussion here.
Well, that's why, I'm sorry.
Again, is the idea of what is the counterfactual that we're measuring this carbon neutrality against? So we have a number of institutions that have ceased using number 6 fuel oil and they're burning wood chips. Are we going to tell them, oh, that's bad, go back to burning oil? The question is, what's the counterfactual? Right. And that's why these things require, and the counterfactual can change, because like I was saying before, we really liked biomass and electricity compared to coal. And in fact, part of the reason this all got started, we were trying to get away from nuclear power. We got rid of our nuclear power plant, our interest in the Seabrook plant. And I don't want nuclear power for a minute, but there are a few environmentalists who are saying, the way to carbon neutrality for the world could be coming over the way to nuclear power, because we're not sure we're nuts about these scenarios that have so much wind towers and solar farms all over the place. And I don't have a dog in that race one way or another, but I do think we need to think about this in terms of what is the counterfactual that we're comparing this to. And compared to one counterfactual, it's one answer compared to a different counterfactual. It might be equally reasonable, it might be a different answer.
I was just going to follow up on Ivan's comment and say that's, 30 years is our time frame, and I think we all kind of agree it is. That's why we need to get going on if silvicultural interventions are going to work, we need to start like tomorrow morning because those are going to take a while to work through the system. And
well, let's talk about that then. I don't believe there's a silvicultural intervention out there that's going to increase the amount of carbon. It's been shown you can put it on a marketable tree quicker, a bigger, more marketable tree quicker with silviculture. But just try to capture photons and turn it into biomass, turn it into sequestered carbon, there's very little you can actually do.
I'm not sure I agree with you on that, Si, although I've been hearing you say that for many years and I still don't know the answer. But because lots of little trees or a few big trees, same amount of carbon, I get the idea. But I'm anxious to see more science on that. And, maybe Dave's hybrid larch could do better than any other. I don't know.
Okay, there are a few species, and I'll tell you the three that they are. It's larch, it's Norway spruce, and it's white pine. Those are the three that actually, according to Bill Leake and others, will accumulate, beat the average, and everything else is average on a tons per acre per year.
Mhm.
Those three.
Mhm. Okay, it's 5:30, 5:28 according to my clock. Let me just well, we should wrap this up. Any thoughts about next time? I've got 3 topics that we might talk about, and we can do anything you guys want to do. I've been trying to get in Mike, I think his name, no, Grant Domke, who's with the Forest Service, Northern Forest Station, who does the work on the equations on carbon and harvested wood products. And he knows everything about that. And he knows the international laws, the IPCC regulations. If anybody, and I'm anxious to learn about this topic without reading a ton of material. Would anyone like to hear from Grant about how you calculate, according to law, storage and carbon in harvested wood products? Is that of interest to people? I see
Yes.
a couple of yeses. Okay, I'm going to try to get Grant. I tried to get him last fall, but he couldn't meet the day we were meeting. So I'm going to try him again. And if I can't get him for February, maybe we can get him for March. But I'll put that, and we may have to go with the day that works for him, which is fine, in sometime in February. The other thing is I'd like to learn more about combined heat and power. I don't know much about that, and we talked about it earlier. So there's a topic of possibility. I just don't know much about it. And we got, we could get Jim Robbins to come and talk to us about his combined heat and power plant. And then the third topic, I want to get Stacy Knapp and I guess Dan Hayes, if Adam's still here, whoever's working on the carbon budget at the state level, and how that balance sheet is working out. Remember, Stacy's got to figure out how to get the carbon balance sheet done for the state, and she's got till next January, I think, a year from now, to figure it all out. And I know Dan Hayes is working on it. Adam, maybe you're working on it with him.
Yeah, and Ivan and I, and this is convenient because we're been working with Stacy on putting forward a proposal on how to make this more long-term and more efficient and clear and all that.
That would be great.
It would be a good time where on that end, it's fresh in their mind.
Okay, would like the next month or two be okay for you guys maybe walking us through what you're thinking, or is that too soon? No, seems okay.
It'd be fine.
So maybe I'll see what Grant Domke can do, and then otherwise maybe I'll get up with you guys about stepping in and bringing us up to speed on the state budget. So that'll probably
I sent John, I sent an email to Hemet to see who might be good for CHP at the university. So
okay,
I'll let you know if he gets back to me.
okay.
Hey, Ivan, the other one to contact is talk to Shane.
Oh yes, perfect.
He's got his hands in lots of pies there, so he'll at least probably tell you who like, yeah, this is the one probably is the first to go to. Yeah, Lloyd's giving a thumbs up there.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Today is the 20th of. If we stick with our Wednesdays, 1, 2, 3, either the 10th or the 17th. Anybody? 10th or 17th? They look okay. Wednesdays afternoons.
Is President's Day week when a lot of people are off, but maybe that won't affect many people here. And I don't know if that fits with the university's winter break or not, but the 10th or the 17th.
So you're saying the 10th is better, Lloyd? 10th is better?
There are no university breaks this coming semester.
Oh, okay.
So seriously.
All right, everybody.
Sugarloaf all the time, right?
Yeah, our break is this week, right? That's what they said. We have
It's
spring
true.
break in January. That's what they
That's it.
told.
I'm going to shoot for the 10th. I'm going to get up with Grant and see if he can do something on the 10th. If not, I may be back to you, Adam and Ivan and Stacy. So so everybody hang on to the 10th for now, 4 to 5:30, and we'll come up with something interesting. And Jake, thank you for all that work, and Ken too, because I know Ken was somewhere behind the scenes making sure your conversions were right and all that. He didn't say
Wizard of
much.
Oz.
So, but that was really interesting, and it's a great group. To thank you all for being a part of this, and we'll keep going. Okay,
Thank you.
signing
sir.
Yeah,
off.
and thank you, John.
Yeah, you bet. Happy
Thanks
to.
a lot, John.
All right,
Thanks,
take
John.
care, everybody.
Take care, Bob.
Everybody.
Bye.